For as long as I can remember, the name Sophie Cunningham has been uttered with something approaching reverence by publishers, writers and readers, and no wonder. Sophie has worked as an editor, writer and publisher for 25 years. She was an editor and publisher for McPhee Gribble, Penguin, Lonely Planet and Allen and Unwin. Her own writing has been published in the Best Australian Essays and the Best Australian Fiction. Her first novel, Geography, was published in 2004 and her second, Bird, in 2008. Most recently, she was editor of Meanjin Quarterly, Melbourne's oldest literary journal, and her latest book is about and is called Melbourne. Now, whether it's as an editor or a publisher, as a writer of fiction or non-fiction, in her commentary, her newspaper columns, her reviews or her public speaking, Sophie's career has been a celebration and a championing of the written word. And perhaps most importantly, given tonight's focus, she's also been a passionate advocate of women's writing. Most recently, Sophie has been involved in setting up the Stella Prize for Australian women's literature. And as someone who shares that steering committee with her, I can say that her experience, her intelligence and her good sense has been an absolute pleasure to witness. And there's been a lot of talk recently about a crisis in our writing culture, but I think things would be far less bleak if there were more Sophie Cunninghams in the world. So can you please welcome Sophie?
That was extremely lovely of you, Monica. Thank you. I'm very touched. I've named this keynote after the Helen Reddy song, I Am Woman, which is the slightly alarming lines, I'm still an embryo with a long, long way to go until I make my brother understand. And don't worry, I'm not going to actually burst into song, but I used to. It was my favourite song as a kid. Reddy first sung that song back in 1970, but while the women's movement is no longer embryonic, the sentiment unfortunately still holds. We still do have a long way to go. Indeed, after a rapid acceleration in women's rights in the 70s and 80s, things have started to go backwards. But I've also referred to a quote from what is, I confess, a slightly corny anthem, because I wanted to gesture to the rhetoric I want to revitalise. And we need, to quote a friend with whom I recently discussed the retro politics inherent in activism, to bring flares back. But I'm thinking that perhaps I should have called this talk The Invisible Woman, for reasons I'm going to elaborate on. But before I move into the focus of my talk, I want to begin with an image, well, a vivid description of events, which since I read them have left me with a picture that encapsulates the incredible complexities of what women have to deal with today. And this might seem like an emotional start to a talk, which is in fact going to focus on some less shattering issues. But I do believe that the violence I'll briefly describe is related to women's invisibility and their lack of economic autonomy. And I'm afraid in this 45 minutes or so, I don't have time to do justice to the complexity of women's rights across a range of cultures. My focus is on Western women, mainly Australian women, and I'm keeping things close to home. But I do want us to keep this bigger picture in mind. For the last few months, I've been thinking off and on about Lara Logan, the 60 Minutes journalist who was attacked by a mob of dozens, if not hundreds of men in Tahrir Square in Cairo in the wake of President Mubarak's ousting earlier this year. In an interview about that night, Logan described what had happened. In part, she said, to break the silence of women journalists on the subject of sexual violence. She described being beaten, her hair being pulled from her head and being digitally raped. She assumed she was going to die. The attack went on for a very extended period of time. But this was the assault's unexpected ending, and I'm quoting Logan now. I almost fell into the lap of this woman on the ground who was head to toe in black, just her eyes. I remember just her eyes, and she put her arms around me. And oh my God, I can't tell you what that moment was like for me. I wasn't safe yet because the mob was still trying to get at me. But now it wasn't just about me anymore, it was about their women, and that was what saved me, I think. The women closed ranks around me. Women seem to be everywhere, but we're not in nearly as many places as you think, because invisibility is normalised. And we, by which I mean both men and women, don't really notice how much we have disappeared. Women have disappeared from a culture. But as I'll elaborate on in this talk, any area of culture where women represent about a third of the output, paintings, winning awards, writing, is about as good as it's going to get. I'm sure most people laughed recently when V.S. Nepal was asked if he considered any woman writer his literary match. He said, "I don't think so," and went on to say of Jane Austen that he couldn't possibly share her sentimental ambitions, her sentimental sense of the world. He said, "I read a piece of writing and with a paragraph or two I know whether it's by a woman or not. I think it's unequal to me." But frankly, I suspect the only crime Nepal committed was saying out loud what many people think. You also have to wonder why it was thought necessary to ask him the question in the first place. His response was predictable. It led to yet another flurry of angst about sexism within the arts community, without, of course, getting the debate anywhere at all. More shocking to me was the fact that in May, Esquire magazine had an article that was published an article titled 75 Books Every Man Must Read, and there was only one woman on it, Flannery O'Connor. In general, a question that underlies much of what I'm going to say is, why are we in the arts community so placent on this subject? Indeed, organisations that like to think of themselves as liberal have a track record that as bad or worse than many other organisations that we think of as more conservative. That bastion of liberal creativity, Sesame Street, now I don't want you to laugh here, but it did not have a lead female Muppet until its 37th season. That was in 2006, when Abby Cadabby, a fairy was launched onto the scene. As well, behind the scenes, most of the puppeteers have been men, and Miss Piggy has always been played by male puppeteers. And it kind of sounds funny, but it's actually, I think it's really significant. The show that's been going for so many decades has not had any female characters at its centre. As has been fairly recently discussed, has been widely discussed in recent months, partly because of the work that people like Monica and myself have been doing. Women are much less likely to win literary awards, to write reviews of books, or to have their books reviewed. And this is despite the fact that they do write about half the books that are published. In 2009 and 2011, the Miles Franklin had all male shortlists. The question I had back in 2009 was whether the judges were really suggesting that not a single one of the following female writers who'd all had books published in that year deserved a shortlisting: Michelle de Kretser, Helen Garner, Amanda Lowry, Joan London, Kate Grenville. As well as that, there were the writers that were longlisted for the award: Toni Jordan, Claire Thomas and Sophie Laguna. When announcing that list, Morag Fraser said that she and her fellow judges had, quote, walked out of our 2-hour shortlist meeting without realising what we had done. She went on to say, "I'm sorry, you can draw no conclusions from it." But I did draw conclusions. I drew them in 2009 and again when it happened in 2011. Women continue to be marginalised in our culture. Their words are deemed less interesting, less knowledgeable, less well-formed, less worldly and less worthy. And the statistics are on my side in this distressing matter. Since the Miles Franklin Award began in 1957, a woman has won the award only 13 times. Since 2001, they've won it twice out of the last 10 years. With other fiction, I'm going to just do a brisk jog through some other statistics of prizes. The Queensland Premier's Prize has been won by a woman 4 out of 12 times. The Age Book of the Year 14 out of 36 times. Well, in fact, 15 out of 37 times now. The New South Wales Premier's Award 11 out of 31 times. The Victoria's Premier Award only 8 out of 26 times. Benjamin Law wrote in The Drum in June this year, "What are you supposed to make of the raw figures? Books written by women are reviewed less. Women win fewer prizes. If that is a meritocracy, then you have to buy into the argument that books by women must be inherently inferior. I can't accept that. The danger on relying on a meritocracy is assuming one actually exists." The gender differential in every area of the literary world is shocking. Surveys consistently find women read more books than men, especially fiction, and as Ian McEwan once put it, when women stop reading, the novel will be dead. But while men are buying around 20% of the books, they're doing most of the reviewing of them, and as I've already said, those books are usually written by men. I'm not going to go through all the figures again. If you're interested, you'll find them in the July edition of Kill Your Darlings. But just throw one random figure into the mix. The Publisher's Weekly list of top 10 books of 2009 was all male, and when their attention was drawn to the statistic, they said their response was uncannily close to that of the Miles Franklin judges. They said, "We wanted the list to reflect what we thought were the top 10 books of the year with no other consideration. We ignored gender and genre and who had the buzz. It disturbed us when we were done that our list was all male." Again, women were simply invisible. Certainly one thing women writers don't have, another problem that women writers do experience is that they have problem in getting their work considered to be literary. And my experience as both a publisher and a novelist has been that when men write novels drawn from life, it's still considered a proper novel, as it should be. But when these qualities are in a work by a woman, they used to dismiss the books. And here's Benjamin Law again on the subject. When I used to work as a music writer, I can't tell you the amount of times I heard music festival organisers, managers, publicists, musicians and punters, men and women, telling me they didn't like the sound of a woman singing. In the book world, I've also heard writers, editors, critics and publishers complaining that female writers don't write about the big picture enough, as if families or interior lives aren't part of something panoramic and worldly. Lionel Shriver recently said in The Guardian, smart female authors who twig that their careers depend on writing solely for their own gender will instinctively narrow their subject matter. Meanwhile, gauzy covers with shy titles signal that the literary establishment needn't take this work seriously. Having said all that, things are actually better in the literary scene for women than they are in many other sectors of the arts. I just want to give you some figures from the fine arts scene. A lot of these figures come from a blog spot called The Countess, a nameless woman who works in the fine arts scene, who's been kind of keeping track of these kind of figures. The Calder family collection was unveiled at the Australian Gallery of New South Wales in May this year. It is by all accounts an extremely impressive personal collection, and the donation was extremely generous. But I was really struck at the time that I read almost no public comment on the fact that the collection holds 194 works by men and only 2 by women. The invisibility of women's invisibility that I'm commenting on here. In 2010, the MCA held a new acquisitions exhibition. To quote the Countess, the exhibition, quote, showcases recent acquisitions of mainly male artists alongside selected works of male artists from the existing MCA and JW Power collections. The actual figures were 5 women to 18 men. And here are just some figures on acquisitions of other Australian galleries in the last 10 years. And those figures have magically disappeared from my presentation. But it was something, certainly for the Gallery of New South Wales, it was about a third of the acquisitions, but in the Victorian National Gallery, it was more like 10%. The figures for Brisbane, Goma, are about 25%. In 2010, at Archibald Portrait Prize, only 7 artists of the 34 finalists were women. And in fact, even more shockingly, only 4 of the portraits were of women. Before she died, Amy Winehouse performed at England's biggest rock festival, Glastonbury, several times, but she never headlined it, despite arguably having one of the best blues voices in the world. But no, until Beyonce had closed the festival in January, a woman hadn't headlined that festival for 20 years. Things were better, if not ideal, before 1992 in the festival's first 20 years, when women like Susan Vega and Sinead O'Connor did headline it. For years, and I'm quoting American figures here, symphony orchestras struggled to hire a critical mass of women. Women auditioned, but the hiring committee said their music just wasn't as good as their male counterparts. To try and deal with this, hiring committees put up screens during auditions so that a musician's gender couldn't be known. At that point, the likelihood of a woman's selection for the orchestra increased 7-fold. This lack of RESPECT is not just an international issue. When Triple J held a poll in 2009 on the listeners' perception of the top 100 singles of all time, there wasn't one female solo performer on it. Not one. Things are really bad in the theatre as well. This was made starkly obvious when Belvoir Street announced its program for 2010 by calling directors up on stage. The first director called up was a woman, the next 10 were men. The visual image of 10 men in suits and 1 woman in a white shirt made an unintended comment upon the representation of women in theatre, and a pretty statistically correct one at that. The best figures for Australia credit female writers of theatre in 2011 with only 16% of performed texts. Women playwrights are virtually non-existent in the canon of classics, and all this despite the fact that, according to Chris Mead, the Artistic Director of Playwriting Australia, has said that the number of plays submitted for development opportunities are roughly divided between men and women. And this actually keeps coming up, that at ground level there is many women as men entering a range of professions. So it's not simply a case that there are not as many women involved, because at the start there usually are as many women involved in most of these different sectors. In the UK, about 70% of the work developed for stage is by women. In the US, only 11% of plays produced on Broadway were by women. And I would actually say that the figures for independent theatres do tend to be more positive. Figures for Europe have been harder to come by, but I know of Germany's major theatre company, and I'm not going to I'm going to get the name wrong, so I won't say it, has a stable of 32 playwrights, living and dead, and of these only 3 are women. An active group of women in theatre, the Women Directors Forum, have been working towards resolving this issue as a result of the kind of outcry around the time of Belvoir Street in 2010. And on August the 12th, just a couple of weeks ago, a national roundtable was held in Sydney to come up with some constructive solutions to deal with this issue, and rumours abound that these discussions did not go particularly well. I had trouble getting people to comment on the record as to why that might have been. In discussing film, I'd like to stray a bit further afield, and that is talk briefly about the Hollywood mainstream rather than the film scene in Australia. And it's fair to say, I think, that Hollywood's pitched fairly squarely at teenage boys, so I suspect a lot of adult men, let alone women, would be feeling pretty grumpy about Hollywood as well. Some of you will have heard me talk about the Bechdel test before, but I do want to repeat it again. It's pretty simple. It's a test that lesbian cartoonists came up with to kind of, well, I'll just read it out, you get the idea of what it's about, just kind of see how many films actually engage with women at all. And these are the 3 questions to ask. How many films can you think of that have at least 2 women who talk to each other about something other than a man? And it's shocking how few mainstream films actually do those 3 things. Of recent films, you'd say Bridesmaid does pass the test, albeit with flying vomit, but Cowboys and Aliens apparently fails it. One real growth area for cinema has been animation, and the number of adults now attending and enjoying films made for kids. One of the most impressive companies in this area is Pixar. They made Up, Toy Story, Finding Nemo, Monsters Inc. and A Bug's Life. Their films have never had a female star, never. Boo does not count in Monsters Inc. because she was not considered the central character, and in there's another Monsters Inc. film coming and there's no Boo apparently. This is particularly upsetting because these films are seen by millions of people and they're pitched at children. And it bugs me in the same way that I'm upset that closer to home, in a series of seminars being run throughout 2011 on VC English texts, only 2 of those 15 texts are written by women. Louise Swin commented on this a few months ago, saying, these are kids going through school and this is what they're reading. And then we tell the girls that their voices are just as worthwhile. The situation at Pixar is set to change in June 2012 with the release of Brave, which has a red-headed and strong-hearted girl as its star. If you Google it, you'll find the really lovely trailer for the film. I'd been hoping I could show it tonight. You have to try and ignore the comments underneath the trailer that call the diminutive digital cartoon character ugly. But one of the distressing things about this film is that the woman who has been developing this film for many years, animator Chapman, I've actually lost her first name, sorry. She was fired from the set. I think, this is a quote, I think it's a really sad state. We're in the 21st century and there's so few stories geared towards girls, told from a female point of view, said Chapman, who had spent 6 years working on the film Brave. It was inspired by her relationship with her daughter. She was recently fired because of what she calls, quote, creative differences. She would have been the first woman to edit an animation feature film for Pixar. And to quote a blogger on this industry, Chapman was a first in the industry. A woman directing an animated feature of her own original concept. She's the most reputable female story person in the industry, and if she can't break the ceiling, I don't know who can. I could go on in this manner, but it actually becomes pretty repetitive because this just gets repeated over and over, these kind of statistics. But I think you get the picture. Briefly, I did want to note the irony that while women have traditionally tended to do the cooking, as that task has become more outsourced and provides more economic rewards, it's men who are considered best at it. The cook and the chef phenomenon. I can never say phenomenon, sorry. That women cook for sustenance and to feed families, but men become exceptional at it and run restaurants. Most of us here, I suspect, have watched MasterChef, and we're familiar with the fact that the core judges are all men, even though women have actually won 2 out of 3 years, won that title. But I want to quote a critique of this issue. It was in Huffington Post about an equivalent show in the States, in which the author Tara Sophia Moore discusses the fact that women always lose the show Top Chef. Here's what she said on the matter. Unfortunately, egalitarian views and a desire to support women have nothing to do with bias. Research has shown that bias operates largely unconsciously. That's why I wanted to read this quote, because I'm not blaming, I'm just saying that it's not like people deliberately set out to do this. Bias is based not on one's conscious ideas about a particular group, but on the stereotypes to which one has been exposed. People who work in the food world, like the judges, have been conditioned over and over again to think of culinary geniuses as male. Whether they like it or not, that will colour their perception of the dishes, the very taste of the food in their mouths. And I suppose at this point, I've been banging on about it for 15 minutes. You do need to. Does this matter? Do these issues of representation, of formal acknowledgement, do they really matter? Apart from the fact that women feel a bit left out. Well, yes, they do. As well as it being important to girls and to women's sense of the world to see women in the public sphere, this erasure of female talent has an economic impact on women's careers. And I'm not crying poor for Beyonce here, but things like performing at headlining Glastonbury set musicians up for an entire career. And that's never a woman who's doing it, they're less likely to kind of break into stardom in that way, much closer to home and with much less money involved. When it comes to honouring our writers, it is writers who tend to write prizes who can afford to keep on writing. It's worth noting that Kate Grenville, when she won the Orange Prize for the idea of perfection, she'd written 5 books of fiction, of which only one had won a prize. The idea of perfection had won no awards at all in Australia. She attributes winning that prize to turning a professional life around, and she's now featured on many Australian prize shortlists that kind of got her over that hurdle. And my point is that the lack of formal recognition of women in writing, in theatre, in design, in architecture, in art, has a quantifiable effect on women's careers and their capacity to earn money. I've been having versions of these conversations about women and representation for 30 years. I have to try and remind myself that there have been significant political changes for women in the last 30, 40 years. Feminism has a history that takes us back to Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792. She said, "If woman be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, for truth must be common to all." Degree is the female eunuch. The sight of women talking together has always made men uneasy. It still does, and it still should. To Kat Banyard's The Equality Illusion was only published last year. In reality, the struggle for gender equality has only just begun. We are still very early on in the process of unpicking from our society the laws, decrees, practices and cultures that have accumulated over millennia to enshrine women's subordination. There have been huge gains for women's rights over the past century. There have been 3 periods of intense activity, often referred to as 3 waves of feminism. And those waves have delivered many reforms. In Australia, those reforms have included the removal of the sales tax on contraceptive, the Supporting Mothers Benefit in 1973, the ratification of the UN Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Sex Discrimination Act in 1984. In 1986 was the Affirmative Action, Equal Employment Opportunity for Women Act, Childcare Rebate 1993, Gender Pay Equity Provision in the Fair Work Act 2009, and in fact very recently Paid Parental Leave. And we have female leaders across the country, from the Prime Minister down. That said, if you're a woman in Parliament, you get meowed at. If you're Julia Gillard, you get constant references to your appearance and the sound of your voice. And as Annabelle Crabb pointed out in an article in November last year on The Drum, appearance for women is equated with competence in a way that it is not for men. That is, male politicians do get sent up for the way they look as well, but it doesn't have as much undermine their kind of gravitas in the same way. Annie Lennox pointed out in an article on International Women's Day in March this year that in Britain there are more men called David or Nick in Parliament than there are women. Ms Magazine recently blogged that researchers at Georgetown's University Centre on Education and the Workforce had compiled a report on how education affects women's earning. I actually had quite a lot about this, but I think I just really put it bluntly. What they found was a woman needs to get a PhD to have her wage match that of a man with a BA. Skin colour is also a mediating factor, so it's particularly bad news if you're a black woman. Closer to home, a paper given by Anne Summers to the Victorian Premier's Women's Summit in 2009, she said, on virtually every measure, women are behind and going backwards. And indeed, I'd like to thank Anne Summers for many of the figures I'm going to go on to quote. Australia has just 58% of women in the workforce compared with, I've said here compared with 72% of men, but clearly that doesn't add up to 100. And I think I was comparing them to the US or France. The number of women executive managers declining from 12% has declined. It was 12% in 2006, it's now 10.7%. To put it another way, 46% of Australian companies have no women in management at all, compared with only 15% of companies in the US have no women in management. 56% of law graduates are women. By the time lawyers are 40, only 25% of Australia's practising lawyers are women. Women lawyers suffer a 62% pay gap. The Law Council of Australia stated that in 2007 in New South Wales, male graduates were paid $70,300 as their first pay, while women received $63,500. So I had quite a lot in my talk about how women need to learn to be more assertive. I think they do. But the bottom line is that you can be as assertive as you like, but you're starting from a lower base. And every time you ask for a pay rise, you've got to get a lot more to even come close to earning the same as a man does. And this becomes more significant the higher your wage, obviously, because you get more tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars involved. Publishing, a sector close to my heart, predominantly female industry, 72% of the workers in publishing are women, but most senior positions are held by men, and 68% of the men who work in the industry earn more than $100,000 as opposed to 32% of the women. The wage gap's getting worse. In 1991, women's full-time average weekly earnings were 85% of men's. Now the gap has widened to 83%. If current earning patterns continue, the average 25-year-old male starting work today will earn $2.4 million over the next 40 years, while the average 25-year-old woman will earn $1.5 million. To quote Anne Summers, there's a $1 million penalty for being a woman in Australia today. At the end of last year, the community sector began its battle for better pay, and the historic equal pay case went before the Fair Work Australia Tribunal and sought to prove that low pay is typical of the societal undervaluing of women caring work. And on the 16th of May this year, Fair Work Australia did rule that social and community service workers in the not-for-profit sector are underpaid, and that part of the reason for this underpayment is their gender. Sexual assaults continue to rise. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, sexual assaults have increased by 51% since 1995, at an average of 4% a year. During 2010, there were 17,757 victims of sexual assault recorded by police. 25% of these victims were aged between 10 to 14 years, and the majority of all sexual assault victims were women, 85%. Only yesterday in the paper, it was reported that if the gap between what men and women earn in the workforce could be closed, it would increase economic activity in Australia by 180 billion. And he was saying that he felt there needed to be a more affirmative action policies. In summary, so I've kind of covered a lot of material, and it does get a bit dry talking about statistics, but women do 2/3 of the world's work for 10% of the world's income. They own 1% of the means of production. 70% of those living on $1 or less a day are women. When food is short in families, women feed their children rather than themselves, which means they're dying at a far greater rate than men. In developing countries, women between 15 and 24 are 6 times more likely to contact AIDS. Disasters, ever increasing as climate change bites, kills more women than men. 90% of the 140,000 people killed in the 1991 Bangladesh cyclone were women. In the 2004 Asian tsunami disaster, 3 times more women died than men. Here I quote Annie Lennox again, gender-based violence causes more deaths and disabilities among women of childbearing age than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents and war combined. Even in the war-ravaged Democratic Republic of Congo, it's safer to be a soldier than a woman. I want to briefly talk about why things are getting worse in Australia specifically. Keating began to drop the ball on women's issues towards the end of his term, and women's issues had, relatively speaking, flourished under both Fraser and Hawke. But after John Howard's election in 1996, there was an aggressive and successful series of cuts and policies that rolled back the advances made in the rights of women over the previous 25 years. And I have Monica and Zora Simic to thank for this. They write about this in their book, The Great Feminist Denial. Women's bureaus in the various public service departments were systematically shut down, though at first the Office of the Status of Women was maintained in the Cabinet Office. In 2004, the position was downgraded to the Office of Women and seated in the Department of Families, Communities and Indigenous Affairs. Talk of women's rights stopped to be replaced by talk of the family, working families. I won't inflict too many more statistics on you here, but it's worth noting that $150 million was taken from childcare between 1996 and 2000 by the Howard government. A lot of centres had to close down, and a lot of poorer women couldn't. It was costing them more to put their kids into childcare than what they were going to earn at work. And here I'm quoting Anne, more women were driven from the workforce in Fairfield and Liverpool and in Sydney's western suburbs after federal funding cutbacks to childcare than the total direct job losses in the BHP steelworks closure. But women did not have a union arguing for their cause as the BHP workers did. The Gillard government has begun to improve the situation, but it's going to take a long time to make back some of the ground that was lost over those 11 years of the Howard government. These policy windbacks were achieved alongside the kind of rhetoric that characterised the culture wars. One which, that rhetoric, which I have started, it was helped by the Howard years, but I hasten to say it started before them. There was a lot of emphasis on what Dux and Simic dubbed the troll-like HLL, hairy-legged lesbian, which created the sense in younger generations that to be a feminist you had to hate men and reject penetrative sex. Putting aside the fact that in my experience it can be quite fun to be an HLL, this kind of representation creates the impression that radical feminism represented feminism as a whole. That is, to identify as a feminist you had to embrace a very particular ideology, which made a lot of women feel constrained from wanting to identify as feminist. At the same time, feminism was becoming more enshrined in the academies, and while that's positive in some ways, a lot of women also started to think they had to be an expert to be able to call themselves a feminist, that it was a specialty, an academic specialty. The media did their bit to make it more difficult for women to identify as feminists, and I'll talk a bit more about that further on. In The Great Feminist Denial, they quote John Howard declaring, quote, "Fortunately, I wish I could impersonate him. Fortunately, I think today's younger women are more in the post-feminist period." What a postmodern guy. That quote came from an article by Piers Ackerman published in the Herald Sun entitled "Feminism is Dead." After the announcement of the 2011 Miles Franklin shortlist, Alison Croggan wrote on the drum, "A world loaded in favour of one sex accounts for the pyramidal structure of gender. At the wide bottom of the writing world, the world of amateur writers on the internet, for instance, women, if anything, dominate. The closer you get to the top, the fewer women there are. At the very top, as is in this year's Miles Franklin, the presence of women is an exception. What to do about it? One thing is certain," and this is really the point of this quote, "passively assuming women are equal and will gradually work their way to equal status doesn't work. We need to find some different tools." I agree with Croggan, as I hope is obvious at this point of the talk, that the issues surrounding the economic and cultural rights of women are not being resolved by the free market. What are these different tools going to be? Some of the new tools are old tools. There is more talk and there has been a real flourishing of grassroots action going on in Melbourne, and I actually think this is really significant. There are feminist salons being held in pubs in Collingwood. There's a regular event called Women of Letters. There's been Slut Walk. A group of us, as Monica mentioned, have set up a committee where it's trying to establish a prize to award women writers. These sound like small things, but the number of small gestures are increasing at a rate that suggests a real momentum is developing once again in the women's movement. The prize that we're striving to establish, we're calling ourselves the Stellas, after Stella Miles Franklin, have received much support, but there's also no doubt that some people find the idea of affirmative action though we like to think of it more as a celebration, but some people find it patronising. Quite a few women find it patronising. And I do understand that resistance. Being angry about the inequality that exists is distracting and demoralising. We all spend much of our life trying not to dwell on these things. And also I think we in the arts community like to think we're above it all. But I don't think that putting our head in the sand is going to change anything. And Summers again. A lot of people are worried about quotas, especially women. I hear many women say they want to get there on merit. The trouble is we do not have a merit-based system in this country. People are promoted for all sorts of reasons: networks, connections, old school tie, golf buddies, competence, luck, nepotism and so on. And I find it interesting that people would argue correctly that you can't deny climate change because we have a few cold days in a row, or it's been raining in Victoria this year. That is, who argue you have to look at long-term trends, are more than happy to say that it's just been a bad year for women's writing or women's theatre. That is, that they don't refuse to actually acknowledge that this is part of decades of systematic exclusion. And I think for some women it's because it's painful to think that that might be the case. So we need to find new ways to advocate for women's voices in the face of their ongoing marginalisation, their cultural and economic. And we need to ignore the inevitable suggestion that to advocate in this way is tokenism, sexist, unfair or unnecessary. I want to return to Greer's quote, "The sight of women talking together has always made men uneasy." It's worth noting that in the corporate world, the pressure is being put on companies to lift their game, and this relates to my point about talk really, that they don't have to do anything. All they have to do is report on the kind of the gender breakdown of their workforces and on their senior management. But even that is having a really positive effect. But just their behaviour being visible is mean that they're making a lot more effort to put women on boards. And I know at the Stella we're hoping that simply by having raised some of the issues we have regarding women in writing, that literary editors and publishers are pausing for thought. But obviously simply talking isn't enough. I think that factors such as gender need to be consciously taken into account in judging, awarding grants, interviewing for jobs. And I know that when I've worked as a peer of the Literature Board of the Australia Council, I've been on judging panels, I think about gender, ethnicity, whether Tasmania is there, whether there are enough poets, all those things. It's part of the job. And I don't mean by that you automatically give prizes or money or spots on the board to people you don't think are worthy. What you do is make a really conscious effort to adjust for blind spots. To be honest, my blind spot when it came to fiction I chose to publish at Meanjin, the literary journal I edited for 3 years, was men. I had to auto-correct to make sure that men were being given a fair go in the journal because I tended to publish work by women. And I didn't have a problem with having to do that because I knew that the journal had a general audience and that I had a bias, if you like. But change isn't as simple as introducing quotas or passing laws. You can make it illegal for women to be beaten. You can make it illegal for them to be raped. But legislation can't force men, or indeed women, to find the style in which women write or paint or sing more gripping or important. It can't insist that women become more confident and assertive. You could also argue, to quote Alison Croggan again, that quotas provide a simple answer that evades the real work, changing the complex of ideologies that situate the white, abled, middle-class male subject as the normative consciousness, which constitutes anyone else as other. She identifies that work as consciousness raising and ongoing conversation, and again, I agree with her. The focus of this talk has been on material feminism, and that's for a range of reasons. In part because I think there's a particular bottleneck in recent feminist debates that I'm keen to avoid. While I've got a little sympathy for what is called raunch feminism, the focus on women's right to enjoy and celebrate their sexuality in whatever ways they please, this focus has played into the media's hands somewhat, as it seems most keen to discuss issues of feminism when the matter at hand is slut war or pornography. They're much less likely to run with stories about women's invisibility in Australia's daily life, in the ways I've documented above, or run with a series of stories that investigate the long-term implications of the economic inequity most women face. The pornography debate takes us dangerously close to the obsessions that rule in the US, porn, abortion, and associated moral panic. As well, one of the more exciting things about the pornography debate from the media's point of view is that it ends in a kind of feminist, it usually ends in feminist fighting among themselves, kind of intellectual mud wrestling. Now, I don't blame feminism for the ways in which the media take them up, but I do sometimes wish they were a bit more mindful about it. I was concerned by the attacks made by feminists against other feminists that the slut walks were middle class, because class and status is no protection from violence. And I'd like to quickly pay my respects to Julie Ramage here. On the flip side of that, I was very uncomfortable with the ways in which women thought it okay to attack and dismiss Gail Dines when she was promoting her book Pornland recently. The resistance to a feminism which expresses discomfort with particular forms of representation of sexuality seems to be a way of reassuring men and each other that things aren't going to get too radical, that we still desire men, that they won't be left behind or ignored. It's a debate that's acutely aware, if you like, of the male gaze. And while the focus of the talk hasn't been specifically on politics of the body, I do want to mention before I end that I know, and this might sound self-indulgent, but I do have a broader point, trust me, that I know many terrific women who worry far too much about their weight and appearance. Some of these women are big, some of them are perfect, and some of them are thin. But I think I mention it here because I think that most women feel keenly their mass, their visibility. It embarrasses them. It's one of the reasons why women don't put themselves forward as often as they should, why they're uncertain of their expertise, why they don't lobby for work, for raises, for seniority. This shame is something that Greer talked about in The Female Eunuch, and Caitlin Moran talks about in the recently published How to Be a Woman, which I haven't read, but people tell me is terrific. There is a link, obviously, between the material and the body, between being underpaid and low self-esteem, the consumer and the consumed, and it holds us back. And to my friends who don't like their knees, their feet, their stomach, their toes, their bums, their faces, their skin, I want to say to you something, that this shame that stalks you, that you live with every minute of every day, is political. We all feel it. It's like tinnitus, and we just have to learn to ignore it. It's one of the ways in which we do patriarchy and capitalism's work for it. We put energy into self-loathing at the cost of our well-being and achievement, personal and professional. American storyteller and researcher Brené Brown argues that the opposite of connection is shame, which she describes as excruciating vulnerability, and that's in a way what I was talking about then, that really extreme self-consciousness that I know a lot of women feel most of the time. And I've been working on this essay, lines from a poem by Adrienne Rich, keep coming back to me. No one lives in this room without confronting the whiteness of the wall behind the poems, planks of books, photographs of dead heroines, without contemplating last and late the true nature of poetry, the drive to connect, the dream of a common language. Turkish writer Elif Shafak recently argued that without connection, people and cultures wither, and that stories allow us to transcend ghettos. That is why perhaps the suggestion that there are fewer films being watched, paintings being painted, plays being performed, books written by women being read, seems to me so deeply concerned, and I believe it is related to increased sexual violence and decreased economic power. And in conclusion, so we will have time for questions. I wasn't quite sure how long this talk would take. I'd like to return to the image of another female journalist. This one closer to home, a woman called Jacqueline Maley. This happened to her this week in her own country, at a no confidence rally organised by the leader of the opposition, Tony Abbott. Alan Jones was addressing the rally. Maley asked Jones if he was being paid to appear at the rally, and I'm quoting her now. He said, of course he hadn't taken a fee. I thanked him for answering and walked away. But Jones wasn't finished with me. Jones shouted at me across the crowd. He yelled that I should look in the mirror and asked me to repeat where I was from. My question was stupid. His vitriol was apparent, and he bristled with aggression. The altercation attracted the attention of the protesters among whom I was standing. Some of them started to mutter and curse in my direction. People rounded on me. I began to feel very intimidated. A woman next to me began screaming abuse. She said I had no right to be there, that I should go away because I was a lefty. As I walked away, Jones bellowed to cheers from the crowd. Where is she? Oh, she's gone, disappeared. Where is she? Can't stand in front, can't stand in front. This is a rally organised by the leader, a possible Prime Minister of this country. Leaders in this country are actively cultivating a climate in which women are bullied into disappearing even further from our culture's public spaces. And this is precisely the point where we need to become more visible. And indeed, women are beginning, once again, I think, to react in more public ways to their ongoing disconnection from culture and from economic power. A new wave, a fourth wave, if you want to call it that, of feminism, it's needed, but I think it's coming. Thank you.
That's fantastic.
That was fantastic. Questions. Now we've got about 10 minutes for questions, so keep them brief and not a statement, because Sophie's here to make the statement in response. So we've got microphones going around. Put your hands up.
The business about the awards is pretty discouraging. Women do the reading, and there are a lot of women writers. What happens at the cash register? Do women buy women writers' books?
Certainly, yes, they do.
And in large amounts or in smaller amounts, or what?
No, I think fairly evenly, if anything, maybe more. So I think women readers are reading women's books. They tend to be books that are considered genre books, but it is true that women writers are getting supported by an audience, even if they're not by those kind of more formal status. So that is good. About 80% of novels are bought by women.
Good.
There was a stripy...
Oh, yes. You talked about women in public and professional life in Australia over the last 20 years going backwards, essentially in terms of pay gaps, etc. But I've noticed that that's happened across the world, and it hasn't been just down to John Howard. What do you make of that, that there's almost been a feminist backlash, homosexual panic, whatever it's been?
I think that the attack on childcare is specific to Australia, and so that, say in France, they have a much higher, there's a lot more childcare and they have one of the highest rates of women in the workforce, and I'm not totally on top of what's happening in French politics. So I do think that government had a very particular agenda. So but yes, look, I do agree with you that certainly in terms of representation, it is broader than that, and it's not just about a specific government. I think it's more to do with the fact that women have become embarrassed to identify as feminist, or indeed feel disenfranchised from feminism, and that once you kind of splinter and you're not part of a kind of group or don't have a sense of togetherness, it becomes harder to kind of stand up or fight about these issues. I think that's why I wanted to start with the image of Lara Logan and the sense of women closing ranks around her.
Thanks, that was fantastic. Can I just ask, to what extent do you think that the situation that you've described to us is in part, or has in part been caused by an insistence, which has also come from within feminism, that in fact women are not one group, that there are many varieties of women, that they come from many ethnicities and races, and they have a great deal of difference, and that therefore they can't be seen as a collective?
I do think that's is part of the problem. I suppose that's what when I talked about wishing that feminism was sometimes more mindful of how the debates, those sort of internal debates, get kind of projected out into the broader world, so there's a sense of constant infighting. That's an exaggeration, but and it hasn't. Indeed, by saying this, I'll probably bring it upon myself. But when I spoke about some of these issues at Triple R the other day, the first phone call was someone saying, "But what about the burqa? Why haven't you addressed the burqa?" And that was a way, really, of kind of saying, that's real. Worrying about what's happening in the Middle East, that's real feminism. Close to home, it's not real because the suffering isn't extreme. What's happening to women in the Western culture isn't as extreme, and you can constantly it's a way, the constantly kind of splintering of groups. So I do think there needs to be a slightly more sense of remembering ourselves of what unites us. Remembering as a group what unites us.
Yep.
Thanks, Sophie, that was great. As an older woman, and getting older and older every day,
yes, we all
I've
are.
become more conscious that maybe that invisibility gets even worse as you get older as a woman, because women's collateral is their sexual desirability. Would you comment on that? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, no, I do. I do think it is an important issue. I think it's one of the reasons why there's generational tension in feminism. I think when you're 25, Monica, I've discussed that, you don't quite get how bad some of the issues are, because men treat you like you're terrific all the time. And so you don't kind of really get that same... You don't get it until you're actually more senior, going for the same jobs they are, starting to become a bit antsy about what you're being paid, which tends to happen when you're sort of no longer seen as desirable. And that's when it's a bit like a door slammed. So I do think it takes a little while for people to realise those problems creep up on you. And certainly I have very much identified as not as a raunch feminist, but was more dismissive about. I felt that feminism had got a lot further when I was younger because I was less affected, if you like, by some of the problems.
Over here.
Hi. You talked a lot about prizes and judging, and like anything, the methodology by which they're judged has got to be in some ways a problem. Are those methodologies being looked at, and are women being asked to actually reassess? Because, as you say, you need to be mindful of blind spots, but the criteria they're being judged on, you know.
I do think that people need to become, certainly companies like the Australia Council, or not company, you know, government bodies, you are expected to explain your methodology. People have the right to ring and ask why they haven't got grants, and they have to be given feedback. And that's been government's attempt, I think, to kind of get some control over the kind of thinking that goes on. And of course those organisations often get accused of political correctness because they are being mindful and clear about their thinking. But I think in the arts there is a kind of slightly hokey thing about you don't have to justify it, it's just whether you like it or not. And I do think liking things is very complicated, and that there should actually be a little bit more accountability. I'm judging the Vogel this year, and I used to administrate it many years ago, and I've noticed that they want a lot more paperwork, as they should. They want you to kind of explain why you like certain books, why you've chosen them. They're giving authors more feedback, and I think that's been maybe then their response, not just to gender issues, but well, actually in that case probably not helped by Helen Demidenko-Darville, but there has been more accountability within that organisation. So, but a lot of the time it's just a lot of talk about how you feel and how can you kind of legislate or how can you kind of make people like something, which is not good enough.
We've got time for one more question. Just up the front.
I'm curious about how you modernise feminism in some respects, because I think we're losing the battle of hearts and minds with the young women's population who you've just agreed don't see it as a particularly pertinent issue. And I think they see it as sour grapes because we're just not winning.
I think that's changing. I would have agreed with you 10 years ago, but I actually now think a lot of young women I know are starting. That's one of the reasons why I said I think that there's a new wave of feminism coming, because I've noticed in recent years a lot of younger women are getting really engaged in these issues again. And I mentioned that there's a kind of lot of discussion groups going on that I'm aware of in Melbourne, and I don't know that was the case 10 years ago. So I actually do think that. I think that. Because things are getting worse, that women are becoming more aware of what feminism's needed for them, some of the losses. I think the kind of activism has changed and it has become more fragmented, as was mentioned before, so there could well be, people don't always know what other groups are doing, and maybe what needs to happen is there need to be kind of more, some kind of structural way of kind of the groups communicating between each other, or there being a greater awareness between different kind of organisations as to what they're up to. But I do actually think that I know a lot of young women who are very engaged. I don't know if you.
Yeah. I think it's happening. I think it's happening differently than the 70s. Yeah. Can we put our hands together for Sophie? And thank you.
I don't know how to get rid of